Hi Security Tube. Welcome to part 3 of the wireless LAN security mega primer. Now I've named this one Pawning Beacon Frames, and people who already know a little bit of wireless may even have a hint about what I'm going to show. Anyway, this is going to be an interesting video where first we look at the basics of beacon frames and then look at how we can pawn them or use them to our advantage. So here's a very simple wireless network, which we are kind of looking at. You have the attacker laptop with the alpha card, which is actually us, right? Hopefully all of you have an alpha card or a substitute. And then you have the victim laptop, then probably a smartphone connected, may not even be connected, doesn't really matter. And then an access point, of course, right? Simple network. But in this case, we'll just look at the access point. Now, before we begin, it's important to understand WLAN packets. Let me draw a quick analogy. If you remember the wired side, LAN, then what you typically have is the Ethernet frame, and inside that you would have IP, within which you could have either TCP or UDP, and then of course application layers would follow, right? Similarly, in wireless LANs, you have a WLAN header and different kinds of WLAN packets. Very broadly, 3 packets: management, data, and control. Now, one of the interesting aspects is that each one of these types has multiple subtypes, a lot of which we will confront during this entire video series, which we will use to our advantage. Now, if you're really curious about what these types, subtypes, and all of that huge amount of information is, you're most welcome to visit the web page containing the IEEE 802.11 standard and spend a couple of weeks reading the 1000 plus page documentation, right? Anyway, what I am going to do in this primer is pick up only those types and subtypes which have significance from a security or hacking perspective, right? Because after all, this is a WLAN security course and not a WLAN primer. Here is a quick breakdown of the different subtypes for individual types. So you have management frames with a lot of subtypes such as association packets, authentication, deauthentication, association, disassociation. Don't worry if all of this is Greek. We will look at multiple of these packets in later videos. Then you have control packets. Most important is the CTS and RTS, which is clear to send and request to send. And finally, last but not the least, the data packets, where our data will be sent across the network. Okay, so let's take it bit by bit. Now, one of the most important devices which you have on your wireless network is this little gadget called the access point. Now, let's start from the very basic principles. What we do is name this access point as something which we can identify with, right? And that is what is called the SSID, or the service set identifier. Now, SSID is like a name given to an access point or to a network consisting of multiple access points. What that means is, let's say you have a university called IIT and you have 10 access points. You may actually want to name them, all of them, IIT, and give them the same SSID, right? Now, the second thing, if most of you would have already noticed with access points, is that whenever you start your Windows machine or your Mac and look at the available wireless networks, you see a list of them, right? So how does your laptop actually go about finding that access point? And this is where a very important concept comes in called beacon frames, which are broadcast frames sent out periodically by access points to broadcast their presence in the current RF vicinity, right? Okay, so what we will do now is we'll start Wireshark and start sniffing for these beacon frames. So let's go to our backtrack instance. Let's go full screen. Let's open up a little command prompt. And the first thing to do is plug in your card if you haven't done so already. It should momentarily kind of very quickly appear. It does. And we'll just bring up the card very quickly once again. So if you watch the previous videos, you should be comfortable with all of these steps by now. By the way, thanks for all the encouraging comments. Please keep them coming. I mean, when I read your comments, the first thing I want to do is make more videos, so keep them coming. Now the next step, if all of you remember, is to quickly create a monitor mode interface, which is Mon0. Now all our friends are up, and what we're going to do is launch Wireshark. And go about sniffing on the Mon0 interface. Right? So we see a lot of traffic in the immediate vicinity. Let's just stop the capture for a second. And what we mentioned earlier was that any access point broadcasts its presence using beacon frames, right? Now, if you closely look at these packets, you will actually find that it says beacon frame here. Protocol is 802.11. And there is some access point which is broadcasting these packets, right? So let's understand these beacon frames. I have selected one of these beacon frames, and now let's look at the breakdown of this frame using Wireshark. Right? So the first thing we are looking at actually is the 802.11 beacon frame header, right? Now the first part consists of a generic header which all 802.11 packets are supposed to have. We will look at various fields in this header in later videos and understand their security implications. Now in this video, all we are concerned with is the type and subtype. And if you notice, it says beacon frame. Now, if you're a little bit more curious, you could just click on the frame control, and that would expand, and it would say, well, your type is management frame and the subtype is 8, which actually denotes the beacon frame. Okay, so now what we have discovered is this is 1, a management frame, and 2, subtype is actually 8, which denotes the beacon frame. You can compare this with the table I had shown in the previous slide. Now we'll look at rest of these headers later. What we are interested in is actually in the management frame header itself, where you have two different kinds of parameters. One is fixed and the other is tagged. So let's look at a couple of this. The first thing of importance to us is it actually says, well, the transmitter of this beacon frame is an access point, right? That's important. We'll come to why that is in a later video. And in tag parameters, the first thing we notice is the SSID. Now, if you click on this, you notice that SSID is actually set to Vivek, which is my home access point, right? I'm also letting go of the MAC address. Well, feel free to do whatever you want. Couple of other interesting things is the supported rates, right? This actually tells what capabilities the access point has as far as transmission is concerned. So you have 1, 2, 5.5 megabits, 11, 18, 24, 36 and 54. Another important parameter is the current channel, which is set to 1, right? This is where the access point is actually residing, on that specific channel. So if a client has to connect to this access point and send data, it has to itself put the card on channel 1 and then connect to the access point. This is an exercise we'll do in the next video. After this, the other interesting thing is the vendor specific tag, which actually says WPA, right? Something to do with the encryption, as most of you may have guessed. So this is a quick breakup. There are also a lot of other informations which are available. We'll dig up a couple of these in later videos as and when required, so don't worry about it. Now, what is the first thing you notice? Everything in this management frame and subtype beacon is actually in plain text. There is no encryption, and there does not seem to be any signature based mechanism or something like that. So what this typically means is, if an attacker has the capability to go ahead and inject packets into the network, probably using raw sockets over wireless, then he will be able to inject arbitrary beacon frames, right? Uh, let's go back to the slide and understand a little bit more about this. Oops. Here we are. So here comes the next part, which is tada, pawning beacon frames. Now, as we just mentioned, anyone can actually create and transmit arbitrary beacon frames if the card supports it, which actually means, well, you have the firmware as well as the software driver support. And number two, of course, you have to have a program which can actually do all of that injection, the raw packet injection. Now, the interesting thing is that if we succeed in doing this, all clients in the vicinity of our spoofed beacon frames would actually report a new access point, right? Very interesting. In probably a couple of later videos, I'll teach you how to program your own packet injectors for wireless. But now, we'll just use a simple tool on Backtrack 4 called MDK. Full form stands for Murder, Death, Kill. Right? So, demo time. Let's go back to our VM and let's go to full screen. Yes. Let's go back to the shell prompt. Let's actually take a new one. What we can do is we go to pen test, and from there we go to wireless, and I think there's a directory called MDK3. Enter that. Let's just go ahead and run MDK3. No arguments. This will actually give you a quick breakdown of all the different modes which are there. We will use a couple of modes later. The one we are interested in for the time being is actually the beacon flood mode, right? B. So let's actually use this to figure out the different options which are available. MDK3. Can quickly do a help with the B option, right? So this tells us the various options we have along with the beacon flood. Now, various things I would encourage you to explore this documentation and try out various ones. I'll take one case in which what we can actually do is we can specifically go ahead and set it to an SSID. So now what I'm going to do is, if you remember in Wireshark, we had actually gone ahead and seen this SSID parameter which actually advertised the SSID of the access point. So what we will do is we'll create arbitrary beacon frames which will go ahead and add a new SSID. So okay, here is how we can do it. Let's give MDK the monitor mode interface name mon0. B is for the beacon flood, and then -n is for the SSID, and let's say pond. Sounds good. Let's go ahead, run the tool. So if you notice, what this is doing is it's changing its MAC address and actually pumping beacon frames on various different channels with the SSID pond, right? So now what we could also try and do is kind of start sniffing. Stop the sniffing immediately, and you notice a lot of beacon frames with the SSID pond in them, as you can clearly see here, right? And if we go ahead and look at the SSID, it actually says pond. Hopefully all of you can look at it right now, pond, right? So MDK is actually sending out these thousands of beacon frames out into the air on various channels with various BSSID or the access point MAC address combinations to confuse the wireless clients around, right? Uh, we can actually verify this. Let me actually switch back from full screen mode back to my Mac, and if I actually start looking at the different networks available, you would notice that I can actually see pond on my Mac as well, right? I could also quickly just open up my iPhone and probably show you. The issue is you'll get to see a mirror image, but I think you should be able to probably kind of figure out what I really meant. Interesting, right? So the tool is actively running right now, and we are able to see this fictitious network pond, which actually doesn't exist anywhere. And I don't know if this is visible properly, but you should be able to see pond on the phone as well. Can you see that? Pond. Awesome. And signal strength seems to be very high, right? So not just laptops, but also mobile devices or anything capable of picking up Wi-Fi signals is going ahead and showing me that a network pond is existing. And when in reality, that network, well, is just a fictitious network created by the MDK tool. So let's quickly go back to our presentation. Okay, so what have we learned? Spoofing 802.11 frames is very simple. Why? First, all of them are plain text. Second, there is no encryption to protect the actual headers of management data and control frames, which means all the headers are out into the open. And specifically, there is no way anyone can stop an attacker from actually generating spoofed frames and pushing them into the air. Now, in the wired network case, an attacker would have to be part of the wired LAN to do this. Now, see the difference here. An attacker could be sitting in a parking lot, could put his little alpha into 1 watt, maybe even use a directional antenna and actually send a signal out, a directed signal towards a corporate network or towards a store. Now, a corollary of this is, well, if I can spoof any access point or any beacon frame for the time being, that actually means if there is an authorized network called Vivek, I could have just created a beacon frame flood for Vivek as well, which may end up confusing a lot of legitimate clients also. In later videos, we'll look at how an attacker can take advantage of this and force a client to connect to him instead of the authorized network, right? This is a class of attacks called misassociation attacks. We'll look at them later. Anyway, so some of you may remember that this is quite similar to the TCP IP based spoofing attacks. And we will use this feature, that is the ability to create and inject arbitrary frames with kind of our own created MAC headers in various attacks all through this course. Okay, so that brings us to the end of part 3. Hope you enjoyed it. I would really recommend you try out the examples while you're following this, or else very soon I might lose you. And if you've enjoyed this, and even if you haven't, leave behind your comments. I'm very open to criticism. I'm also learning all the time, so I'd be happy to hear back from you. So please, please, please leave behind your comments. That's all for this video. Thank you and enjoy.